bar was the kind of place where the lights were always dim, and the music was just loud enough to drown out the noise of the city outside. It was a popular spot, known for its extensive drink menu and the sleek, modern decor that attracted a steady stream of patrons from all walks of life. Tonight, it was particularly busy, with the after-work crowd mingling over cocktails and craft beers, the low hum of conversation filling the air. Jaden pushed open the heavy wooden door and stepped inside. He was immediately struck by the warmth of the place, a stark contrast to the cool autumn air outside. Dressed in a tailored suit and polished shoes, he looked every bit the successful young professional. As he moved further into the bar, he noticed a few heads turn, but he was used to that. His presence had a way of commanding attention, not just because of his sharp appearance, but also because of the quiet confidence he exuded. He walked over to the bar, scanning the rows of bottles lining the shelves. The bartender, Tom, was busy chatting with a group of customers at the far end of the counter. Jaden took a seat on one of the high stools, placing his phone and wallet on the counter in front of him. He caught Tom's eye and nodded politely, a silent signal that he was ready to order. But Tom didn't respond. Instead, he turned back to the group of young professionals he'd been serving, laughing at something one of them said. Jaden frowned slightly, but didn't think much of it at first. It was a busy night, and bartenders had to juggle multiple orders at once. He could wait a few more minutes. As he waited, Jaden looked around the bar, observing the scene. It was a typical Thursday night crowd, mostly people in their 20s and 30s, unwinding after a long day at work. The place had a relaxed yet lively atmosphere, with groups of friends gathered around tables, couples sitting close together, and solo patrons like him taking a moment to themselves. Minutes passed, and Jaden noticed that Tom still hadn't come over to take his order. He watched as Tom served another customer who had just walked up to the bar. The man, white and casually dressed, was immediately greeted with a smile and a prompt offer to take his order. Jaden's frown deepened. He straightened up in his seat, raising his hand slightly to catch Tom's attention again. "Excuse me," Jaden called out, his voice calm but firm. Tom glanced in his direction, his expression unreadable. For a brief moment, their eyes met, but then Tom turned away, pretending not to have heard. Instead, he moved further down the bar, pouring drinks for a pair of women who had just arrived. Jaden's patience began to wear thin. He had been nothing but polite, but it was clear now that Tom was deliberately ignoring him. A knot of frustration formed in his chest, but he forced himself to remain composed. He wasn't going to make a scene, not yet. He glanced around, noticing that a few other patrons were watching the interaction, or rather, the lack thereof. He leaned forward on the counter, tapping his fingers lightly against the polished wood. His mind raced, trying to understand what was happening. Was this just bad service? Or was there something more to it? The uncomfortable possibility that this was about more than just a busy night at the bar began to creep into his thoughts. Just then, Tom approached another customer, a young woman who had taken a seat a few stools down from Jaden. She smiled at Tom, who smiled back, his demeanor warm and friendly. Jaden watched as Tom effortlessly engaged her in conversation, recommending a drink from the menu. Jaden took a deep breath, trying to steady his rising irritation. He wasn't the type to jump to conclusions, but the signs were becoming too obvious to ignore. He had been at the bar long before these other customers, yet Tom had chosen to serve everyone else but him. There was no mistaking the pattern now. The tension in the air thickened as Jaden sat there, his patience wearing thinner with each passing second. He was no stranger to subtle slights, the kind that others might overlook or dismiss, but this was blatant. His thoughts began to swirl with frustration and disbelief, but he kept his expression neutral, refusing to let the situation get the better of him. Jaden's attention snapped back to Tom, who was now laughing at a joke the young woman had made. It was clear that the bartender had no intention of serving him, and the realization hit Jaden like a cold slap. He glanced around the bar once more, hoping to catch the eye of another bartender, or perhaps even the manager, but Tom seemed to be the only one behind the counter tonight. Jaden clenched his jaw, feeling the sting of the situation. It wasn't just about being ignored, it was about what this implied. He could feel the eyes of the other patrons on him, some of them aware of the growing tension, others blissfully unaware as they enjoyed their evening. But for Jaden, this was more than just an inconvenience. It was a reminder of the subtle, yet painful ways discrimination could manifest, even in the most seemingly progressive places. Jaden sat quietly at the bar, his patience now replaced with a simmering frustration. He had been waiting for what felt like an eternity, though in reality, it had only been about 20 minutes. 20 minutes of being blatantly ignored while others were promptly served. The irritation that had started as a small flicker was now a steady flame, burning hotter with each passing moment. Tom, the bartender, continued to move about the bar with an air of casual indifference, serving one customer after another. Jaden watched as Tom chatted with the regulars, joked with the newcomers, and even offered a few free samples to a group of young men in suits who had clearly just come from work. Yet, each time Tom glanced in Jaden's direction, there was a coldness, a deliberate choice to look away and focus on someone else. The bar, which had once seemed so inviting, now felt stifling to Jaden. He glanced around at the other patrons. Some were too absorbed in their conversations to notice what was happening, while others occasionally shot him sympathetic glances, but no one said anything. No one intervened. It was as if the scene was playing out in a vacuum, where Jaden's frustration and anger existed in isolation. A man sitting a few stools down leaned over and whispered to his companion, who looked over at Jaden and then at Tom. The companion shook his head slightly, a small gesture of disapproval, but neither of them did more than exchange a knowing glance. Jaden caught this interaction and felt a pang of resentment. It wasn't enough to be seen. He wanted anyone to acknowledge what was happening, to validate the injustice of it all. He cleared his throat, the sound more forceful this time, cutting through the low hum of the bar. "Excuse me," Jaden said again, louder, his voice carrying a subtle edge that hadn't been there before. This time, Tom couldn't ignore him. The bartender turned, a feigned expression of surprise on his face. "Oh, sorry," Tom said, though his tone was anything but apologetic. "He didn't see you there. What can I get you?" Jaden's eyes narrowed slightly as he met Tom's gaze. "I've been waiting for a while," he replied evenly, though the frustration was clear in his voice. "A bourbon neat, please." Tom nodded, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, annoyance, perhaps, or maybe disdain. He turned away to grab a glass, but as he did, Jaden noticed the subtle roll of his eyes. It was a small gesture, almost imperceptible, but it spoke volumes. Jaden's jaw tightened. He had seen that look before, countless times in different settings, and it always carried the same message: "You're not welcome here." As Tom poured the bourbon, Jaden couldn't help but replay the events of the evening in his mind. He had walked in, just like any other customer, expecting the same level of service, the same courtesy. But from the moment he had taken his seat at the bar, he had been treated as less than. It was a feeling he knew all too well, one that gnawed at the edges of his dignity, reminding him of the countless times he had been made to feel invisible because of the color of his skin. When Tom finally set the drink down in front of him, the glass made a sharp clink against the counter, the sound harsher than it needed to be. Jaden stared at the drink for a moment, his fingers wrapping around the cool glass. He lifted it to his lips and took a slow sip, the warmth of the bourbon spreading through him, doing little to quell the anger simmering beneath the surface. Tom had already moved on, serving another customer with the same easygoing charm that had been so noticeably absent in his interactions with Jaden. As he watched Tom, Jaden felt a bitter taste in his mouth, one that had nothing to do with the drink. He had come here to unwind after a long day, to enjoy a quiet evening in a place that was supposed to be welcoming to all. But instead, he had found himself in the middle of yet another exhausting and demoralizing experience, one that was all too familiar. Jaden's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of laughter coming from a group near the end of the bar. He turned his head slightly to see a trio of women, all white, who had just been served their drinks by Tom. They clinked their glasses together, toasting to something Jaden couldn't hear. Tom, standing nearby, flashed them a broad smile, his demeanor completely different from the cold, distant manner he had shown Jaden. As Jaden sat there, watching the scene unfold, a part of him wanted to get up and leave, to walk out of the bar and never come back. But another part of him, the part that refused to be pushed aside, told him to stay. He wasn't going to let someone like Tom dictate where he could or couldn't go. He had every right to be here, just like anyone else, and he wasn't going to let this bartender's prejudice drive him away. The evening was supposed to be simple, just a drink at the bar before heading home. But now, Jaden found himself at a crossroads. He could choose to stay quiet, to let the slight go unchallenged, or he could stand his ground and confront the issue head-on. It was a decision he had faced many times before, and each time, it weighed heavily on him. Jaden took another sip of his bourbon, his mind made up. He wasn't going to let this go, not this time. He had worked too hard, come too far, to let someone like Tom make him feel small. As he set his glass back down on the counter, Jaden knew that the night was far from over. Whatever happened next, he was ready for it. Jaden's decision to stay had given him a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't going to let this moment pass without standing up for himself. But he also knew he had to be smart about how he handled the situation. Confrontation could easily escalate, especially in a public setting like this, and he wanted to make sure his voice was heard without it turning into a spectacle. He continued to sip his bourbon, his eyes following Tom as the bartender made his rounds. The bar was still bustling, and Tom was busy, But that didn't excuse his blatant disregard for Jaden. The more Jaden thought about it, the more determined he became to address the issue directly. He wasn't just doing this for himself, he was doing it for anyone who had ever been made to feel less than because of who they were. A few minutes later, Tom circled back to Jaden's end of the bar, this time wiping down the counter as he walked by. Jaden seized the moment, leaning forward slightly to catch Tom's attention. "Tom, right?" Jaden asked, his tone measured but firm. Tom looked up, his expression briefly surprised before settling into one of mild disinterest. "Yeah, that's me. What can I do for you?" Jaden held Tom's gaze, refusing to be intimidated by the bartender's dismissive attitude. "I couldn't help but notice that it took a while for you to serve me," Jaden began. "I've been sitting here for quite some time, and I watched as you served multiple people who arrived after me." Tom's face remained impassive, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, irritation, perhaps. "Like I said, it's busy tonight," he replied, his tone clipped. "I'm doing the best I can." Jaden nodded slowly, acknowledging Tom's response but not accepting it. "I understand that, but it feels like you were avoiding me on purpose. I'd like to know why." Tom's eyes narrowed slightly, and for a moment, Jaden thought he saw a flash of defensiveness. "You're imagining things," Tom said, his voice laced with annoyance. "I treat all my customers the same." Jaden didn't flinch. He had expected this kind of response, but he wasn't about to back down. "Are you sure about that?" he asked, keeping his tone even. "Because from where I'm sitting, it doesn't look that way. And I'm pretty sure some of the other patrons noticed it too." At this, Tom's expression hardened. He straightened up, tossing the rag he'd been using to wipe down the counter into a nearby sink. "Look, I don't know what you're trying to imply, but I don't have time for this. If you've got a problem, maybe this isn't the place for you." Jaden felt a surge of anger at Tom's words, but he kept it in check. "You're right. I do have a problem," he said, his voice low but firm. "My problem is that I came here expecting to be treated with the same respect as everyone else, and instead, I've been made to feel like I don't belong. And that's not okay." Tom scoffed, clearly unimpressed by Jaden's resolve. "Look, man, I'm just doing my job. If you don't like the service, you can take your business somewhere else." Jaden's eyes narrowed. "Is that how you handle all your customers? By telling them to leave when they point out something that's wrong? Because I have to say, that's not a very professional attitude." Tom took a step closer, his posture aggressive. "You think you can just come in here and tell me how to do my job?" he snapped. "I've been working here for years, and I know how to handle people like you." Jaden felt a chill run down his spine at the thinly veiled threat in Tom's words. There it was, the mask had slipped, and the truth was out in the open. This wasn't just about bad service. This was about something deeper, something uglier. And now, Jaden knew he couldn't let it slide. Before Jaden could respond, the door to the bar swung open, and a man in his late 50s walked in. He was well-dressed, with a commanding presence that immediately drew the attention of everyone in the room. The noise level dropped slightly as people recognized him. This was Samuel, the owner of the bar, and a respected figure in the community. Samuel's eyes scanned the room, quickly landing on the scene unfolding between Jaden and Tom. His expression tightened as he took in the tense standoff, and without hesitation, he made his way over to the bar. "Tom," Samuel called out, his voice calm but firm. "What's going on here?" Tom's bravado faltered as he turned to face his boss. "Nothing, Mr. Samuel. Just a misunderstanding with a customer." Samuel's gaze shifted to Jaden, his eyes narrowing slightly as he assessed the situation. "Is that so?" he asked, though it was clear he wasn't buying Tom's explanation. "What kind of misunderstanding?" Jaden met Samuel's gaze, recognizing the man immediately. He had seen Samuel's picture in various business publications, knew him to be a fair and respected businessman. But what Tom and the other patrons didn't know was that Jaden wasn't just any customer, he was Samuel's son. Jaden took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "There seems to be some confusion about how customers should be treated here," he said, his tone respectful but firm. "I've been waiting for service for quite a while, but it seems like Tom here had other priorities." Samuel's expression darkened as he turned back to Tom. "Is that true, Tom?" Tom stammered, clearly caught off guard by the turn of events. "I didn't mean anything by it, Mr. Samuel. It's just been a busy night, that's all." Samuel's gaze hardened. "Busy or not, that's no excuse. Every customer deserves to be treated with respect, no matter who they are." The bar had gone completely silent now, all eyes on the unfolding confrontation. Jaden could see the discomfort in Tom's posture, the way he shifted uneasily under Samuel's stern gaze. But it wasn't enough. The damage had been done, and Jayden knew that this moment would have lasting consequences not just for Tom, but for everyone in the bar. As Samuel continued to address Tom, Jayden felt a sense of validation, but also a heaviness. This was the reality he had to face, time and time again. No matter how much success he achieved, how well he dressed, or how polite he was, there would always be people like Tom who saw him as less than. But at least tonight, he had made his stand, and he wasn't alone in doing so. The atmosphere in the bar was thick with tension as Samuel, the owner, stood face to face with Tom. The once lively chatter had died down completely, leaving only the low hum of the bar's background music. All eyes were on the scene unfolding at the counter, where the dynamic between the characters had shifted dramatically. Tom's bravado had all but evaporated under Samuel's intense scrutiny. He fidgeted, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, his earlier confidence replaced by a visible unease. It was clear to everyone present that he had crossed a line, but the full extent of the situation had yet to reveal itself. Samuel took a step closer to Tom, lowering his voice so that only those closest to the bar could hear. Tommy began, his tone measured and firm. This isn't just about one bad interaction. It's about the way you choose to treat people, and that's something I take very seriously. Tom swallowed hard, his eyes darting around as if searching for an escape. Mr. Samuel, I didn't mean anything by it. It's just, I was busy, and I didn't realize. Samuel cut him off with a sharp look. That's enough, he said, his voice carrying a weight that silenced Tom's stammering. Busy or not, your job is to make every customer feel welcome, and you failed to do that. But there's something you don't know, Tom. Something you should have taken the time to find out before you decided to treat this man differently. Samuel turned to Jayden, who had remained quiet throughout the exchange, his expression calm but his eyes reflecting the hurt and frustration he had endured. This is my son, Jayden, Samuel announced, his voice steady but filled with a quiet power. He's not just any customer. He's part owner of this bar. The revelation hit the room like a shockwave. A murmur rippled through the crowd as the patrons processed the information. Tom's face drained of color, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to find words. The realization of what he had done, who he had disrespected, was written all over his face. Jayden felt a mixture of emotions swirl within him as he watched the reactions around him. There was satisfaction in seeing Tom's shock, but also a deep sadness that it had come to this. He hadn't wanted to use his connection to his father to demand respect, but it seemed that in this world, his identity was all too often reduced to who he knew or what he owned. Tom stammered, his voice barely a whisper. Mr. Samuel, I didn't know. I'm so sorry. Samuel held up a hand, silencing him. It doesn't matter if you knew or not. What matters is that you treated someone differently because of your own prejudices, and that's something I will not tolerate in my establishment. You should have known better, Tom. The weight of Samuel's words hung in the air, each one driving home the gravity of the situation. The other patrons watched in stunned silence, many of them shifting uncomfortably in their seats as they realized the full scope of what had happened. Jayden, sensing the opportunity to make a broader point, finally spoke up. This isn't just about me, he said, his voice calm but carrying the strength of his convictions. It's about the way we treat each other, no matter where we come from or what we look like. This kind of behavior, this prejudice, it's not just wrong, it's harmful. It tears people down, makes them feel like they don't belong. And that's not something that should be happening anywhere, especially not here. He glanced around the room, meeting the eyes of several patrons who had been watching the scene unfold. We all have a responsibility to do better, Jayden continued, his voice carrying a quiet intensity. To stand up against this kind of behavior, whether it's happening to us or to someone else. It's not enough to just ignore it and hope it goes away. We have to actively work to make things better. Jayden's words struck a chord with the crowd. A few people nodded in agreement, while others looked down, reflecting on their own actions or inactions. Tom, meanwhile, stood there, his shoulders slumped, the weight of his mistake pressing down on him. Samuel turned back to Tom, his expression stern. Jayden's right. We all have a role to play in making sure this kind of thing doesn't happen again. And as the owner of this bar, it's my job to make sure that everyone who works here understands that. There was a pause as Samuel allowed his words to sink in. Then, in a quieter tone, he added, Tom, I'm going to have to ask you to leave for the night. We'll discuss your future here tomorrow. Tom nodded, his face pale and drawn. He knew better than to argue. With a final shame-filled glance at Jayden, he turned and walked out of the bar, the eyes of every patron following him as he went. As the door closed behind Tom, the tension in the room began to dissipate. Samuel turned back to Jayden, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "I'm sorry you had to go through that," he said quietly, his voice filled with a mixture of regret and pride. "But I'm proud of the way you handled it." Jaden gave a small nod, appreciating his father's words but still feeling the weight of the evening's events. "Thanks," Daddy replied softly. "I just hope this can be a learning moment for everyone here." Samuel smiled gently. "It will be, son. I'll make sure of it." With that, the two of them turned back to the bar, where the patrons were slowly returning to their conversations, though the mood had shifted. There was a new awareness in the air, a recognition that something important had just taken place. Jaden took a seat, feeling a sense of closure but also a lingering unease. He had made his stand, but the reality was that this was just one battle in a much larger fight. Still, as he sipped his bourbon, he knew that tonight, at least, he had made a difference. The bar slowly returned to its usual rhythm, though the tension of the recent confrontation still lingered in the air like an aftertaste. Jaden remained at the bar, his drink nearly finished, as he watched the other patrons try to resume their evening. He could feel the glances in his direction, some curious, others sympathetic, but he focused on his father, Samuel, who stood beside him, still processing everything that had just transpired. Samuel had always prided himself on running a bar that was more than just a place to get a drink. It was a community hub, a place where everyone could feel welcome, regardless of who they were. But tonight had shown him that even in the spaces he thought were safe, prejudice could still rear its ugly head. He sighed, leaning on the counter as he looked around the room. "This isn't what I wanted for this place," Jaden Samuel said quietly, his voice tinged with regret. "I thought we were better than this." Jaden nodded, understanding his father's disappointment. "I know, Dad, but this isn't just about this bar. It's about the world we live in. Prejudice doesn't disappear just because we wish it would. We have to confront it every time it shows up." Samuel sighed again, but this time, there was a resolve in his expression. "You're right, of course. We need to do more than just hope for the best. We need to be active in making sure this place lives up to the ideals we set for it." He straightened up, his demeanor shifting from reflective to decisive. "Starting tomorrow, I'm going to make some changes. We'll hold mandatory training for the staff on how to treat all customers with respect, no exceptions. And I'll make it clear that this kind of behavior won't be tolerated. Not now, not ever." Jaden felt a surge of pride in his father. Samuel had always been a man of integrity, and seeing him take swift action to address the issue only reinforced Jaden's belief in the importance of standing up for what was right. "That sounds like a good start," Jaden replied, his tone warm. "It's about making sure everyone who walks through those doors feels valued." Samuel nodded. "Exactly. And it's about showing people like Tom that their actions have consequences. I'll be having a serious conversation with him tomorrow, but no matter what happens, he needs to understand that this can't happen again." Jaden glanced around the bar once more, noticing that the mood was beginning to lighten. Conversations were picking up again, and a few patrons had returned to the bar for another round of drinks. But there was also a subtle shift in the way people were interacting, more eye contact, more acknowledgement of each other's presence. It was as if the confrontation had sparked a moment of collective introspection. A couple approached Jaden and Samuel, their expressions a mix of apology and respect. The man, in his early 30s, spoke first. "Hey, I just wanted to say, that was really something back there. I'm sorry you had to go through that." His companion, a woman with kind eyes, nodded in agreement. "Yeah, we're regulars here, and we've never seen anything like that. It's not right, and I'm glad you spoke up." Jaden offered them a small smile, appreciating their words. "Thank you. It means a lot to hear that. This kind of thing happens more often than people realize, but it doesn't have to. We can all do better." Samuel reached out to shake their hands. "Thanks for saying that. We're going to make sure this place is the welcoming environment it's supposed to be. I appreciate your support." As the couple returned to their table, Jaden felt a sense of solidarity growing among the patrons. It wasn't just about the incident with Tom anymore. It was about the broader implications of how people treated one another, and the responsibility they all shared in creating a more inclusive community. Jaden finished his drink, setting the empty glass on the counter with a quiet clink. "I think I'm going to head out, Dad. It's been a long night." Samuel nodded, giving his son a warm smile. "I understand. But thank you, Jaden, for everything. You handled this with a lot of grace, and I'm proud of you." Jaden returned the smile, feeling a warmth spread through him that had nothing to do with the bourbon. "Thanks, Dad. I'm proud of you too. I know you'll make sure this place is everything it's supposed to be." They embraced briefly, a gesture of both love and mutual respect, before Jaden picked up his things and made his way to the door. As he left the bar, he couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions: relief that the situation had been addressed, pride in how it had been handled, but also a lingering sadness that these kinds of moments were still necessary. The cool night air hit him as he stepped outside, and Jaden paused for a moment, taking a deep breath. He looked back at the bar, its warm light spilling out into the street, and felt a sense of closure. Tonight had been a reminder of the work that still needed to be done, but it had also shown him the power of standing up and speaking out. With that thought in mind, Jaden walked down the street, his steps steady and his resolve stronger than ever. As Jaden walked away from the bar, the night felt different. The streets, usually filled with the noise and energy of the city, seemed quieter, as if the world was giving him a moment to reflect on what had just happened. The confrontation with Tom, the support from his father, and the reactions from the other patrons had all combined to create a powerful experience, one that left Jaden feeling both hopeful and weary. He made his way down the familiar streets, the cool night air helping to clear his mind. The city lights shimmered around him, casting long shadows on the pavement. Jaden thought about how, despite the progress that had been made over the years, there were still so many barriers to overcome. Moments like the one he had just experienced were a reminder of the work that still lay ahead, not just for him, but for society as a whole. As he walked, Jaden's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out to see a message from his father. "Thank you again, son. We'll make sure this never happens again. Love you." Jaden smiled at the message, feeling a sense of connection to his father that went beyond the typical parent-child bond. They were in this together, working to build a better future, not just for themselves, but for everyone who walked through the doors of their Boers of Aheu. He pocketed the phone and continued walking, eventually reaching a small park he often visited when he needed to think. The park was nearly empty at this hour, just a few people walking their dogs or sitting quietly on benches. Jaden found his usual spot under a large oak tree and sat down, leaning back against the rough bark. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the events of the evening play out in his mind. There was a part of him that still felt angry, not just at Tom, but at the society that allowed such prejudices to persist. But there was also a part of him that felt proud of the way he had handled the situation, proud of the way his father had supported him, and proud of the small but meaningful impact they had made tonight. Jaden opened his eyes and looked up at the sky. The stars were faint, barely visible against the glow of the city lights, but they were there, a reminder of the vastness of the universe and the small role each of them played in it. He thought about the future, about the bar, about his life, and about the kind of world he wanted to help create. He knew that this wouldn't be the last time he would face prejudice or discrimination. It was a reality he had lived with for as long as he could remember, and one that wouldn't disappear overnight. But tonight had shown him that he had the strength to confront it, to challenge it, and to stand up for what was right, even when it was difficult. As he sat there, Jaden made a silent promise to himself. He would continue to fight not just for himself, but for all those who didn't have a voice, who couldn't stand up for themselves. He would use his position, his influence, and his determination to make a difference, however small, in the lives of those around him. After a while, Jaden stood up, feeling a sense of peace settle over him. He left the park and started heading home, his mind already turning to the future. There was work to be done, but he was ready for it. Tonight had been a victory, but it was just one step in a much longer journey. As he walked through the quiet streets, Jaden felt a renewed sense of purpose. He knew that the path ahead wouldn't always be easy, but he was confident that he could face whatever challenges came his way. And with the support of his father and the strength of his convictions, he was ready to take on the world.